The air in CECOT was a thick, breathing thing, heavy with the sweat of 1,000 men, the metallic tang of unclean toilets, and a silent, simmering rage that never quite boiled over. Not fully, not yet. Mateo felt it press against him every waking moment, a physical weight on his chest, even when he tried to ignore the constant low hum of the ventilation system and the distant shouts of guards echoing down the concrete corridors. His bunk, a thin slab of foam on steel, was his only territory, and even that felt temporary, least minute by minute. He kept his eyes mostly on his worn boots, a pair of government issue that chafed his ankles as he navigated the narrow aisles between rows of cots, each occupied by a face that mirrored his own grim resolve or a hollowed-out despair. Survival here was a quiet art, a constant negotiation with the unseen currents of power, a silent promise to himself to simply endure, to not become another statistic, another name screamed into the void by the guards during roll call. The yard, if you could even call the concrete patch a yard, was where the lines were drawn, invisible yet razor-sharp. Today, the tension felt tighter, a drumbeat in his ears. The locos, loud and brazen even under the guards' watchful eyes, were clustered near the rusted water faucet. Their tattoos a roadmap of their loyalty, their swagger a challenge to anyone who dared cross them. Across from them, the esquiletos, quieter, more insidious, eyed them with a predator's patience, their movements subtle, their whispers like snakes in the grass. Mateo belonged to neither, an anomaly, a man caught in the wide net of the mano dura policies, guilty by association, or by simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His only real goal, beyond making it through their day without a beating, was to keep his head down, to fade into the background until his name, by some miracle, appeared on a release list that he knew deep down would never come. But even fading was a luxury in here, a constant performance, a dance on the edge of a blade. The prison didn't tolerate neutrality, not for long. You picked a side, or you became a target for all sides, and Mateo felt that choice pressing down on him, a slow, inevitable squeeze. Sometimes, late at night, when the prison finally settled into a restless hum, a different sound would surface, faint but insistent, a low thrum deep beneath the ground, like a distant engine or something far older, stirring. The older inmates, their eyes carrying the weight of years spent within these walls, sometimes talked in hushed tones about it, about the parts of the prison the guards never patrolled, about places that ran deeper than the foundations, a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels from some other time, some other purpose. They called it El Abismo, the abyss, a place from which nothing good ever came, a place that held secrets even the guards were afraid to unearth. Mateo tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as the prison settling, the pipes groaning. But a cold knot of dread would tighten in his stomach nonetheless, a premonition that some paths led not to freedom, but to a deeper, more profound kind of confinement. He just needed to survive the day, and then the next, and keep ignoring the whispers, both from the men around him and from the hungry earth below. The tension, once a low hum, snapped taut the next morning. It started with the whisper that grew into a roar, a small package of contraband cigarettes found near Mateo's bunk. Not in it, not under it, but dangerously close, as if deliberately placed. The guards, always looking for an excuse, descended like vultures. Officer Ramirez, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with contempt, held up the offending pack, his eyes drilling into Mateo. "Whose is this, pendejo?" he snarled, the question a formality, the accusation already decided. Mateo knew immediately it was a setup. He'd seen it before, countless times. Someone wanted a message sent, a score settled, or perhaps, more likely, a new recruit broken in. The cigarettes belonged to the Escalitos. He recognized the distinct brand, a cheap Salvadoran import that only they managed to smuggle in consistently. Denying it would be useless, a further act of defiance in their eyes. Confessing would mean aligning himself with the Esquilitos, or at least taking the fall for them, making him an enemy of the Locos and a marked man in the eyes of Ramirez, who enjoyed pitting the gangs against each other. A cold sweat pricked his skin. He saw the Locos across the cell block, their faces a mixture of expectation and dark amusement. They wanted to see him squirm, to see him betray one side or the other. He saw the Escalitos, their expressions unreadable, a silent threat in their eyes, daring him to implicate them, or subtly encouraging him to take the fall. This wasn't just about a pack of cigarettes. It was about his place in the hierarchy, about who owned him or who would break him. Ramirez gestured to two larger guards, their batons heavy at their sides. "I'm asking you one last time, boy. You cooperating, or are we gonna have a little chat in the isolation block?" The implied threat was clear, a visit to the infamous caja, a tiny, windowless cell where men often came out changed, or not at all. Mateo's heart hammered against his ribs. He had to choose, right now, between the devil he knew and the devil he didn't. His eyes flickered to an older Esquileto, a man named El Tuerto, one eye milky white from an old injury. El Tuerto gave him the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. A silent command, a subtle promise of protection, or perhaps a future debt. The Locos, sensing the shift, stirred restlessly, their expressions darkening. He had seconds. The choice felt impossible. A no-win scenario, but survival here was never about winning, only about minimizing the loss, about picking the lesser of two evils. The Caja was a terror he'd heard enough stories about, a place where sanity frayed. Aligning with a gang, even implicitly, was a risk, but it was a risk he understood, a game with rules, however brutal. He took a deep breath, the stale air scratching at his throat. He looked Ramirez dead in the eye, trying to project a defiance he didn't entirely feel. "They're mine," Mateo said, his voice surprisingly steady, the words hanging heavy in the air. A ripple went through the cell block. The Locos scowled, their amusement replaced by simmering anger. El Tuerto, however, allowed a thin, almost invisible smile to grace his lips. Mateo had chosen, and the path ahead, whatever it held, had just become irrevocably clearer. He just hoped he hadn't chosen a path to something far worse than he could imagine. He knew he'd bought himself some time, but at what cost? The guards roughly grabbed him, dragging him away, not to the Caja this time, but towards a different kind of reckoning, one that involved new alliances and even deeper dangers. The immediate reckoning wasn't a beating, not exactly, but a public humiliation, a stripping of dignity. Mateo was made to scrub the communal toilets with his bare hands for the rest of the day, under the sneering supervision of Ramirez and a few other guards who found his plight entertaining. The putrid stench burned his nostrils, and the grime caked under his fingernails, a constant reminder of his new, subordinate status. But more than the physical discomfort, it was the shift in the gazes of the other inmates that weighed on him. The Locos now looked at him with open hostility, a declaration of war in their eyes. The Esquiletos, however, offered a different kind of gaze, a proprietorial one, a silent acknowledgement of his sacrifice, a confirmation that he was now, for better or worse, one of their assets. That night, after lights out, El Tuerto approached Mateo's bunk, his presence a dark silhouette against the dim emergency lights. His voice was a low rasp, barely audible over the snores and whispers of the cell block. "You did well, muchacho," he said, his good eye glinting in the gloom. "Loyalty is rare in this place. It buys you protection, It buys you a name. Mateo knew protection came with a price, a deeper entanglement, but he also knew rejecting it now would be fatal. He was in, whether he liked it or not. El Tuerto then began to explain the unwritten laws of CECOT, a complex web of favors, threats, and unspoken boundaries. The guards, they watch the cages, but we watch the shadows, he whispered, a cryptic smile playing on his lips. There are things here they don't see, things they don't want to see, things that move when the lights are low, things that hunger. Mateo listened, his blood running cold despite the stifling heat of the cell. El Tuerto spoke of secret stashes, of tunnels beneath the prison, used for smuggling, for escape, for things more sinister. He spoke of the Old Ones, a term used for the oldest, most powerful inmates, men who had been incarcerated so long they seemed less like prisoners and more like ancient, malevolent spirits guarding hidden realms. He also spoke of the Whispers, a phenomenon Mateo had tried to dismiss as his imagination, the distant thrumming he heard at night. The prison, it breathes, El Tuerto said, his voice dropping to an almost reverent tone. It has its own pulse, deep below. Sometimes it speaks, sometimes it calls. Mateo shivered, a prickle of goosebumps rising on his arms. El Tuerto's words weren't just about gang politics. They were about something ancient, something supernatural, something that defied the concrete and steel of the prison. He described the prison as a living entity, its foundations rooted in something dark, something that predated even the memory of the oldest inmates. Mateo had always prided himself on his pragmatism, his ability to see the world in harsh, logical terms. But El Tuerto's words, combined with the low, persistent thrum he now recognized more distinctly, began to chip away at his rational defenses. There was a faint, almost metallic smell that sometimes permeated the air, not like rust, but something deeper, something mineral and cold, an odor that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath them. He felt a sudden, profound sense of unease, a premonition that the tunnel El Tuerto spoke of wasn't just a physical path for contraband, but a conduit to something far more elemental, a passage not just out of the prison, but into a realm of existence he couldn't possibly comprehend, a place that held the potential for a freedom more terrifying than his current captivity. The air itself felt heavier now, charged with unseen forces, and Mateo realized he had just stepped onto a chessboard where the pieces were not just men, but older, darker things. His survival, he understood with a dawning terror, depended not only on navigating the brutal rules of the gangs and guards, but also on understanding the strange, almost supernatural currents that flowed beneath CECOT. The days that followed were a brutal education. Mateo was quickly pressed into service by the Esquelitos, his tasks ranging from discreetly delivering messages between cells to acting as a lookout during small, controlled skirmishes with the locos over prime spots in the yard. The violence was sharp and sudden, like a switchblade flicking open, but mostly contained, a ritualistic display of dominance rather than an all-out war. He learned to anticipate the subtle cues, the tightening of a jaw, the way an inmate shifted his weight, signals that meant a confrontation was imminent. Each clash, however minor, tightened the knot of fear in his stomach, a constant reminder of the razor's edge he walked. One afternoon, during a transfer of supplies from the main kitchen, a fight broke out. A loco, fueled by a territorial dispute, lunged at an Esquelito. It escalated quickly, a flurry of fists and guttural shouts, drawing the immediate attention of the guards. In the chaos, Mateo, acting on instinct, shoved a guard, creating a momentary distraction that allowed the Esqueleto to escape a severe beating. His quick thinking was noted, not just by the guards, who dealt him a swift, brutal kick to the ribs for his interference, but also by El Tuerto. Later that evening, after the bruises had begun to bloom across Mateo's side, El Tuerto sought him out again. His good eye held a strange intensity. "You have good instincts, muchacho," he rasped, offering a small, crudely wrapped piece of stale bread, a rare commodity. "You see things others don't. You act when others freeze." He paused, then continued, his voice lower, more conspiratorial. "There's a job for you, one that needs a man with a keen eye and a quiet step. A job beneath the prison." Mateo's stomach clenched. The whispers had grown louder since his conversation with El Tuerto, a constant low thrum beneath the concrete, sometimes accompanied by a faint, sickly sweet odor that wasn't quite decay, but something else, something metallic and cloying. He'd seen other inmates, usually the oldest and most withdrawn, staring at walls, their eyes wide with an unspoken terror, sometimes muttering about the deep pulse or the hungry earth. He dismissed it as madness, the toll of years spent in confinement, but a seed of doubt had been planted. El Tuerto explained that there was a section of the old utility tunnels, long abandoned, rumored to lead beyond the prison walls. The Esquelitos had been trying to access it for months, hoping to establish a new smuggling route, or perhaps a way out. But there were difficulties. "Strange things happen down there," El Tuerto admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tools go missing, lights flicker, men hear things, see things that aren't there. Some don't come back." He spoke of a palpable coldness, even in the stifling heat of the tunnels, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. He spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers that weren't human, not quite. Mateo's mind raced. This was the tunnel El Tuerto had alluded to, the one leading to El Abismo. He had heard the low hum, the deep pulse himself. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the old ones. This wasn't just about contraband anymore. It was about something else entirely. "Why me?" Mateo asked, his voice hoarse, the bread suddenly tasteless in his mouth. El Tuerto smiled, a chilling, humorless baring of teeth. "Because you're new, muchacho. You haven't been poisoned by the fear yet, and because you have nothing left to lose, do you? Just another path, deeper into the dark." A wave of dread washed over Mateo, far colder than the phantom chill El Tuerto described. He was being sent into the heart of the mystery, into the very source of the prison's unsettling whispers, and he knew, with a horrifying certainty, that this tunnel might not lead to freedom, but to a deeper, more permanent kind of entrapment. Mateo spent the next few days in a state of suspended dread, the impending journey into the tunnels weighing heavier than any threat from the locos. His attempts to glean more information about El Abismo from other inmates were met with either stony silence or frantic dismissals. The older men would turn away, their faces pale, a silent warning in their haunted eyes. It was a subject they simply refused to discuss, as if merely speaking its name invited some unseen horror. This collective fear only fueled Mateo's growing unease. His alliance with the Esquelitos, once a shield, now felt like a leash. The initial, tentative trust he had earned was eroding, replaced by a chilling realization of his expendability. He was a pawn, a fresh set of eyes to investigate a danger others feared too much to confront themselves. The protection El Tuerto had offered now seemed to encompass the obligation to walk into the unknown for the gang's benefit, a benefit Mateo would likely never see. The true threat, however, started to come not just from the gangs or the mysterious tunnels, but from the system itself, from the guards. Officer Ramirez, in particular, seemed to harbor a special disdain for Mateo. The guard's sneering comments grew more frequent, his shoves more forceful, his punishments more arbitrary. Mateo suspected Ramirez knew of his new, forced affiliation with the Esquelitos, or at least suspected he was involved in something beyond the normal prison grind. The guards, in their own way, cultivated the conflicts between gangs, often using them as a means of control, but that they also brutally suppressed any activity that threatened their absolute authority, especially anything involving unauthorized access to prison infrastructure. One afternoon, during a routine search of the cell block, Ramirez stopped directly in front of Mateo's bunk. He picked up Mateo's tattered copy of Don Quixote, a book he clung to as a last vestige of his old life, and tore a page from it, slowly, deliberately. "Thinking big thoughts, are we, Ilustrado?" Ramirez sneered, the torn paper fluttering to the floor. "Remember where you are. You're just another piece of garbage in my prison. Don't forget it." The act was small, but the message was clear, a direct assault on Mateo's spirits, a reminder of his utter powerlessness. It was a calculated move to break him, to ensure he understood his place. Mateo realized then that his current situation was a three-pronged attack: the gangs, demanding his loyalty and sending him into danger; the prison system, represented by Ramirez, trying to crush his will and make him comply; and beneath it all, the chilling presence of El Abismo, a supernatural force whispered about only in fearful tones. He felt like a mouse caught between three hungry cats, each vying for a piece of him. The fragile alliances he had formed, the small concessions he had made for survival, now seemed insufficient, even dangerous. He was alone, truly alone, caught in a tightening net, and the deeper he went into this new world of prison politics and subterranean mysteries, the less hope he felt for any kind of escape, physical or spiritual. The tunnel, he now understood, was not just a physical place, but a metaphor for his descent into a reality far more complex and terrifying than he had ever imagined. He just had to figure out which cat was going to eat him first, and if there was any way to outsmart them all. The call came in the dead of night, a whispered instruction from an Esqueleto runner to be ready. Mateo was led through a series of seldom-used utility corridors, the air growing colder, heavier, until they reached a nondescript maintenance closet. Inside, behind a stack of rusted spare parts, a section of the wall had been meticulously cut away, revealing a dark, yawning aperture. El Tuerto was waiting there, a crude, battery-powered lantern casting long, dancing shadows. His good eye was alight with a strange anticipation. "Remember what I told you, muchacho," he rasped, handing Mateo a smaller, weaker lantern and a coil of thin rope. "Listen more than you look, and don't stray from the path." As Mateo squeezed through the narrow opening, the metallic, cloying smell he'd come to associate with the whispers grew overpowering. It wasn't just metal, he realized, but something else, something organic and acrid, like old blood mixed with damp earth. The low thrumming was now a palpable vibration, resonating in his chest, in his bones. The tunnel immediately sloped downwards, the air growing thick and heavy, pulling at his lungs. The walls were rough-hewn rock, not the concrete of the prison above, clearly part of an older structure, perhaps even a natural cave system repurposed and forgotten. He descended further, the beam of his weak lantern cutting a meager circle in the oppressive darkness. The path was uneven, slick with dampness, and he had to brace himself against the cold, rough stone. He saw what looked like crude carvings on the walls in places, symbols he didn't recognize, faded with time and moisture. Some looked like stylized eyes, others like abstract, elongated figures. He dismissed them as ancient graffiti, a product of bored minds, but a chill ran down his spine nonetheless. Then he saw it, illuminated by his shaky light. Not just carvings, but structures. Deeper into the main shaft, a vast cavern opened up, far larger than he could have imagined. And in the center, not a natural formation, but a massive, roughly hewn stone altar. Stained dark, with what could only be dried blood, centuries old. Surrounding it were dozens of smaller, intricate carvings on the cave walls, depicting what looked like sacrificial rites. Strange figures with elongated limbs and glowing eyes, offering kneeling humans to some unseen entity. This wasn't a utility tunnel, not just a smuggling route. This was a place of worship, a forgotten temple, buried beneath the prison. His breath caught in his throat. The low thrum intensified, seeming to emanate from the very altar itself. He understood now. The whispers, the deep pulse, the fear in the old inmate's eyes. It wasn't just about an old tunnel. It was about this place. This was El Abismo, a sacred and terrifying site, a place of ancient, dark power that had simply been built over, its malevolent presence seeping into the foundations of the prison above. The metallic, sweet odor was not from pipes, but from what had been done here, what had perhaps still was being done here in the darkness. He also understood why the Esquilados, and perhaps other gangs before them, were so desperate to control this place. It wasn't just for escape or contraband. There was power here, a dangerous, unfathomable power. The implications slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The prison, with its guards and gangs and strict rules, was merely a veneer, a thin skin over something far older, far more potent, and utterly indifferent to the struggles of men. His mission had just shifted from surviving prison to surviving something far more primal, something that had slumbered beneath their feet for centuries and was now, perhaps, beginning to awaken. His path to freedom, he now realized, with a cold dread, might lead through a gateway to a horror he couldn't possibly comprehend. Mateo stumbled back, the images of the blood-stained altar and the grotesque carvings burned into his mind. He turned, scrambling to make his way back to the hidden entrance, the low thrumming now a deafening roar in his ears, when a shadowy figure detached itself from the gloom ahead. It was El Tuerto, not alone, but flanked by two other Esquilados, their faces grim, their eyes hard. "Running so soon, muchacho." El Tuerto's voice was devoid of its usual rasp, cold and cutting, a sound Mateo had never heard from him before. "You haven't even seen the best part." A wave of nausea washed over Mateo. He suddenly understood. The job, the trust, it was all a carefully laid trap. He wasn't meant to scout the tunnel. He was meant to be sacrificed, a fresh offering to whatever ancient evil slumbered beneath CECOT. The symbols, the altar, the history, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. El Tuerto hadn't sent him here for contraband, but for something far more sinister, to appease a force Mateo still couldn't entirely grasp, but which he now knew was terrifyingly real. "What is this?" Mateo stammered, his voice trembling, his small lantern beam shaking wildly, making the shadows dance like mocking specters. El Tuerto chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed eerily in the cavern. "This, muchacho, is the true heart of our power. The guards, the locos, they fear us because we understand this place. We feed it, and it gives us strength, insight, protection. And sometimes, it demands a little something in return." He gestured towards the altar with a sweep of his hand, his eyes gleaming with a fanaticism that chilled Mateo to the bone. "You, my friend, are today's tribute, a small price for the blessings bestowed upon us." One of the other Esquilados, a man Mateo had shared meals with, a man who had offered him a cigarette just days ago, stepped forward. He held a crude, sharpened piece of rebar, its tip glinting menacingly in the dim light. Mateo scrambled backward, his mind racing, searching desperately for an escape. He had seen the sacrifices on the carvings, the terrified faces of the victims, and he realized with a sickening lurch that he was about to become one of them. His loyalty, his desperate attempt to survive by choosing a side, had led him not to safety, but to this, a betrayal far deeper and more terrifying than any he could have imagined. The blow came suddenly, a crushing impact to his head from behind. He felt a searing pain, a rush of black, and then the world spun. He fell, his head striking the rough stone floor with a sickening thud. His lantern rolled away, its light dimming, then flickering out completely, plunging him into utter darkness. He felt hands roughly dragging him, his body limp and unresponsive, towards the altar. The metallic, sweet odor was now overwhelming, filling his lungs, suffocating him. He heard El Tuerto's voice, distant and distorted, chanting in a language Mateo didn't understand, but which resonated with an ancient, malevolent power. He was a lamb to the slaughter, betrayed by the very men he had sought protection from, his sacrifice a fuel for a darkness he could only now begin to perceive. This was the true price of his alliance, a spiritual and physical destruction far worse than any sentence the courts could have handed down. He had walked into the tunnel hoping for a lesser evil, only to find himself in the maw of the greatest evil of all. Mateo awoke to a searing pain in his side, a dull throb in his head, and the distinct taste of blood in his mouth. He was no longer by the altar, but crammed into a small, damp recess in the tunnel wall, barely large enough for him to curl into a fetal position. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the oppressive gloom. He was alone, but the low thrum was still there, a deeper, more insistent pulse, and the metallic, cloying odor was even stronger, seeming to cling to his skin. He touched his side, feeling the sticky warmth of fresh blood. They had cut him, not fatally, not yet, but enough to draw blood, enough to mark him. A chill far colder than the damp air ran through him. He understood. He was to be a slow sacrifice, bled dry, perhaps, or simply left to the mercy of whatever truly inhabited this terrifying space. His betrayal had immediate and brutal consequences, not just for him. Back in the cell block, the fragile peace between the Locos and Esquilitos shattered. News of the Esquilitos' covert activities, perhaps leaked by a dissenting member or discovered by the ever-watchful guards, ignited a furious retaliation. Mateo, hidden deep below, heard the distant screams, the clanging of metal on metal, the frantic shouts of guards and prisoners alike, a muffled symphony of chaos seeping down through the earth. The entire prison, it seemed, was erupting, the delicate balance of power completely undone by the Esquilitos' desperate gambit with El Abismo. The whispered tales of the deep pulse intensified among the inmates. Now they weren't just hushed fears, but frantic warnings. Men spoke of shadows moving on their own in the cell blocks, of unsettling visions, of a palpable drain on their life force. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, even above ground. An irrational fear began to grip the entire population, a collective dread that something ancient and hungry had been roused from its slumber by the rituals in the tunnel. Mateo, alone in the darkness, felt a chilling connection to this escalating horror. His blood, shed on the cold stone, seemed to have somehow anchored him to the ancient malevolence, making him acutely sensitive to its presence. He could almost feel it, a vast, unseen entity stirring beneath the prison, its hunger awakened. He heard sounds that defied logic, faint, guttural growls that vibrated through the rock, whispers that weren't human, not quite, echoing from deeper within the cavern, drawing closer. He saw fleeting glimpses of movement at the edge of his limited vision, shapeless blurs that darted in the gloom just beyond the reach of his failing eyesight. His mind reeled. The fear of death, once paramount, was now intertwined with a far deeper, more existential terror. This wasn't just about dying. It was about being consumed, about becoming a part of something ancient and unholy, losing his very soul to the darkness. He was no longer just a prisoner of the state, nor a pawn in a gang war. He was a captive of a cosmic horror, a sacrifice offered to a power that had been waiting beneath CECOT for centuries, and his own blood, his own betrayal, had sealed his fate. The tunnel, he now knew, was not just a passage to a deeper prison, but a conduit for a monstrous entity, and he was caught squarely in its awakening. The violence above ground, the escalation of gang warfare, it was all merely a symptom, a consequence of the terrifying reality he had been dragged into, a horrifying ripple effect of the evil he now truly understood. He had to escape, not just for his life, but for his very essence, before this monstrous hunger claimed him completely. Mateo, still weak and bleeding, fought off the encroaching despair. He was trapped, yes, but not entirely broken. The survival instinct, sharpened by years of hardship, flickered to life. He forced himself to move, crawling on his hands and knees, exploring the cramped recess where he'd been left. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, a discarded piece of rebar, stained with rust and his own blood. A weapon, however crude, a sliver of hope. He spent what felt like an eternity huddled there, listening, his senses heightened by fear. The growls and whispers from deeper within the cavern seemed to recede, as if the entity was momentarily sated, or perhaps simply biding its time. The chaotic sounds from the prison above had also softened, replaced by a tense, uneasy quiet, punctuated by the occasional distant shout or the clanging of metal. He knew the guards would be cracking down hard now, tightening security, making any escape from the prison itself virtually impossible. A new plan began to form, desperate and unlikely. If the Esqueletos truly believed he was a sacrifice, they wouldn't expect him to fight back or to try and escape through their own territory. He would use their tunnel against them. He would find a way out of this labyrinth, not by ascending back into the prison, but by pushing deeper, past the altar, past the source of the whispers, towards an unknown exit. It was a gamble, a plunge into a darkness more profound than any he had ever known, but it was his only option. He began to move, slowly, painfully, using the rebar to lever himself up. His head still throbbed, his side burned, but a cold resolve had settled over him. He was not going to be a victim. He would not become another name in the prison's history of forgotten men. He would fight. As he began to creep past the altar, he noticed something in the dim light. A small, almost imperceptible crack in the stone wall, partially obscured by rubble. Hope, fragile and terrifying, flared within him. Perhaps this was it, a secret passage, a hidden route, a way out of El Abismo itself. He pushed against the rubble, his adrenaline surging. He managed to dislodge a few loose stones, creating a small opening, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. But as he pushed his head through the gap, a wave of profound despair washed over him, colder than any chill from the cavern. The crack didn't lead to another tunnel, or to the outside world. It opened into a smaller, shallower alcove, barely larger than a coffin, carved into the rock. And within it, sitting perfectly upright, was a desiccated corpse, its leathery skin stretched taut over bone, its eye sockets hollow, its mouth agape in a silent scream. Around its neck hung a crudely fashioned amulet, bearing the same unsettling symbols he had seen on the altar. Its uniform, though ancient and crumbling, was unmistakably that of a CECOT prisoner. The air in the alcove was stagnant, heavy with the scent of dried blood and ancient death. The low thrumming vibrated from within the corpse itself, a chilling resonance. This wasn't an escape route. It was a tomb, a horrifying testament to past sacrifices, the hope he had clutched onto, the belief that there was an out, shattered into a million pieces. His plan, born of desperation, was a cruel joke. He was still trapped, deeper than ever, and the tunnel to a worse place was not just a metaphor, it was a literal, terrifying reality. The weight of his own foolishness, His misplaced trust and the cosmic horror of his situation pressed down on him, threatening to crush him completely. He was not going to escape. He was just going to become another offering, another silent scream in the dark. The sight of the ancient mummified prisoner, frozen in its silent scream, broke something inside Mateo. He recoiled, falling back into the main cavern, the rebar clattering uselessly against the stone. The hope that had sustained him for a fleeting moment dissolved into a profound, chilling despair. He was no longer just afraid for his life. He was afraid for his very soul, for his sanity. This place, El Abismo, it was designed to strip men of everything, to reduce them to terrified, broken things. He curled into a ball on the cold, damp earth, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the guttural whispers from deeper in the cavern seeming to mock him. Memories, raw and unbidden, flooded his mind. His grandmother's face, her gentle touch as she braided his hair, the warmth of the sun on his skin as he played football in the dusty streets of his village, his own face, younger, hopeful, before the arrests, before the accusations, before the crushing weight of a system that didn't care for truth, only for numbers. He remembered the foolish pride he'd felt for protecting his younger brother, taking the fall for a minor infraction that had somehow escalated into his current nightmare. His brother, who would now think him lost, devoured by the system, never knowing the deeper, darker truth. Guilt, heavy and suffocating, settled over him. His choices, every single one of them, seemed to have led him here, to this dark, inescapable maw. He had wanted to be strong, to survive, to protect, but all he had done was make things worse, not just for himself, but for his family, for the very essence of who he was. He was a criminal now, by choice and by circumstance, aligning with the same brutal forces that had destroyed his life on the outside. He had traded one form of captivity for another, deeper one, a physical prison for a spiritual one. The low thrumming of El Abismo, once a distant fear, now felt like the very beating of his own dying heart, a pulse of despair emanating from the earth itself. He wondered if this was what happened to the men who disappeared here, not just physical death, but a complete erasure of their being, their essence absorbed by the hungry darkness. He felt a profound weariness, a desire to simply close his eyes and let the ancient evil claim him, to end the suffering, to end the fight. What was the point of struggling against something so ancient, so vast, so utterly indifferent? He saw the faces of the Esqueletos, El Tuerto's mocking smile, the cold eyes of Ramirez, the distant, unreachable world of freedom. They were all reflections of the same predatory darkness, just different facets of the same terrifying confinement. He was no hero, no survivor, just a man who had made one bad decision after another, each one dragging him deeper into a hell he could no longer comprehend. The tunnel wasn't just a physical path. It was a journey into his own unraveling, a confrontation with his deepest fears, his most profound regrets, and the chilling realization that he was truly, utterly alone, with nothing left but the ghosts of his past and the certainty of his impending consumption. This was the dark night of his soul, and there seemed to be no dawn in sight, only the deepening shadows of an ancient, insatiable hunger. A small, distant clang echoed through the cavern, jolting Mateo from his despair-induced stupor. It was too sharp, too distinct to be the deep thrum of El Abismo. It sounded like metal on stone, like someone was trying to chip away at the tunnel walls. He forced himself to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest, his head pounding. The profound resignation still clung to him, but a flicker of something else, something primal, ignited within him. He was not just meat for sacrifice, not yet. He still breathed, he still thought, he still felt. The clang came again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint scraping sound. He realized with a jolt that it was coming from a different direction, not from the prison entrance, nor from deeper within the cavern, but from a side passage he hadn't noticed before, hidden in the shadows. And with the sounds, a new scent, not the cloying metal and blood, but something familiar, something human. Sweat, and the faint, acrid smell of fear. He clutched the rebar, its cold steel a small comfort against his palm. He had fallen, yes, had come face to face with his own failures and the crushing weight of utter despair. But the sight of the dead prisoner, a chilling premonition of his own possible fate, had also stirred a dormant rage. He wouldn't go down like that, a forgotten husk in a hidden tomb. If he was to die, he would die fighting, on his own terms. He heard muffled voices now, angry whispers. He recognized one, the gruff, distinctive tone of a loco. The gangs were not just fighting above ground, they were also down here, perhaps searching for the Esquilitos, or for the very source of the strange power that was unsettling the prison league. This was his chance, a desperate, unexpected opportunity. His enemies were now closer, and perhaps the enemy of his enemy could be his salvation, however temporary. He crept towards the sounds, moving with renewed caution, the rebar held tight. He rounded a bend in the rough-hewn passage and saw them. 3 locos, their faces streaked with dirt and fear, were trying to break through a section of unstable rock, their crude tools scraping against the stone. They were clearly looking for something or someone, and their frustration was palpable. Before he could decide on a course of action, one of the locos spotted him. "Look, it's the Esqueleto dog," he snarled, his eyes widening with surprise and malice. El Tuerto must have left him for the rats. The other 2 turned, their faces contorted in furious glee. Mateo knew they wouldn't hesitate. A rival gang member, battered and weak, was a prime target. But then an unexpected voice cut through the air. "Hold it!" a gruff voice commanded. It was Diablo, the formidable leader of the Locos, who had emerged from a deeper shadow, his eyes fixed not on Mateo, but on something beyond him, a flicker of movement in the cavern's depths, a shadow that seemed to detach from the wall. Diablo, a man of brutal pragmatism, recognized the deeper threat, the true horror that permeated El Abismo. "He's been bled," Diablo observed, his gaze sweeping over Mateo's wounded side, then hardening. "El Tuerto tried to make him an offering. This place, it's not just a hideout, it's something else entirely." Diablo's eyes, usually cold and calculating, held a glint of genuine fear. He too had felt the shift in the prison, the growing terror. Mateo, seizing the moment, spoke, his voice hoarse but firm. "They're trying to wake something up, Diablo. They think it gives them power, but it only takes. It took that." He gestured towards the crack where the mummified prisoner lay. "And it'll take us all." Diablo considered him, a long, intense stare. He knew Mateo was an Esqueleto, an enemy, but he also knew the rumors, the whispers, the escalating madness above ground. He had felt the chill, the unsettling presence. The true enemy, he realized, was not Mateo, nor even El Tuerto, but the ancient, malevolent force stirring beneath their feet. A grudging respect, born of mutual fear, settled between them. "We go deeper," Diablo finally said, his voice hard, but now tinged with a new, shared purpose. "Not to fight the Esquilitos, not just yet. We go deeper, and we find out what they've truly woken up. We find a way to stop it, or we find a way to escape it, but we do it together." Mateo looked at the fearsome gang leader, a man he had feared and avoided for months, and saw not an enemy, but a desperate, pragmatic ally. His objective had shifted from merely surviving the prison to confronting the cosmic horror that lay beneath it. He was no longer fighting for himself, but for a chance to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. The tunnel, once a symbol of inevitable doom, now presented a desperate, terrifying path towards a new, more profound battle. The uneasy alliance between Mateo and Diablo was forged in the chilling proximity of the ancient evil. Diablo, with his two remaining locos, and Mateo, still bleeding but fueled by a desperate resolve, pushed deeper into the cavern. The rebar Mateo carried now feeling less like a useless stick and more like a symbol of his newfound, desperate defiance. The air grew colder, the metallic, cloying smell intensifying with every step. The low thrum was no longer just a vibration, but a rhythmic pulse, like a monstrous heart beating deep within the earth. They found El Tuerto and the rest of his escalados near the deepest part of the cavern, a vast chamber where the altar stood dominant. El Tuerto was chanting, his voice a hoarse, guttural prayer in a language Mateo instinctively knew was not meant for human tongues. Around him, the other escalitos, their faces pale and gaunt, swayed in a trance-like state, their eyes wide with a terrifying reverence. In the center of the altar, a fresh, gleaming pool of blood pulsed ominously, and from it, a dark, viscous tendril seemed to writhe, reaching towards the cavern ceiling. The entity itself was not fully manifest, not yet, but its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them all. Shadows in the chamber seemed to coalesce, taking on vague, shifting forms. Eyes that weren't eyes glimmered in the darkness, and the whispers were no longer distant, but surged into their minds, a cacophony of ancient, hungry voices, driving them to madness. It was not a physical beast, but a sentient, malevolent void, a hungry consciousness that fed on despair and sacrifice. "You fools!" Diablo roared, his voice cutting through the unnatural chanting. "You'll doom us all!" He charged forward, his remaining locos behind him, armed with crude shivs and lengths of pipe. The confrontation was immediate and brutal. The escalados, fueled by their fanatical devotion, fought back with a terrifying ferocity, their eyes reflecting the strange, unholy light of the awakening entity. Mateo, despite his wounds, found a surge of adrenaline. He recognized the escalado who had struck him, the one with the rebar. He parried a wild swing, then, using the momentum, thrust his own rebar into the man's xiaoyi. The escalado screamed, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the encroaching darkness. This wasn't about gang loyalty anymore. It was about survival, about stopping a cosmic horror that transcended all human laws. As the two gangs clashed, the entity continued its awakening. The dark tendril from the altar writhed faster, growing thicker, reaching higher. The whispers in Mateo's mind grew louder, a chorus of despair, urging him to surrender, to join the endless hunger. He saw glimpses of unimaginable suffering, visions of ancient forgotten worlds consumed by this same darkness. He saw Diablo fighting with a grim determination, engaging El Tuerto in a desperate brawl near the altar. Diablo, a man defined by his pragmatism, was now fighting a battle against something that defied all logic, all reason. He seemed to grasp the full horror of the situation, the true limit of human law and human power against such an ancient evil. Mateo knew he couldn't fight the entity directly. It wasn't a physical opponent, but he could fight its influence, its anchor. His eyes darted to the altar, to the pulsing pool of blood. That was the key, the conduit, the source of its manifestation. With a desperate burst of strength, he pushed through the melee, dodging a wild swing from an escalato, and lunged towards the altar. El Tuerto, his face contorted in a mask of fanatical rage, saw Mateo's intent. He broke away from Diablo, snarling and torched. "You will not stop it!" he shrieked, his voice inhuman. "It is our salvation, our power!" Mateo met him head-on, swinging the rebar with all his remaining strength. The impact was sickening. El Tuerto staggered back, his good eye wide with shock and a sudden, profound terror, not of Mateo, but of what Mateo might accomplish. He fell, his head striking the edge of the altar, his body going limp, his fanaticism extinguished. With El Tuerto defeated, the other Escalados faltered, their trance-like state broken, replaced by fear and confusion. Mateo, ignoring the cries of the remaining combatants, frantically searched the altar. He saw a series of crude, glowing symbols carved into its surface, surrounding the pool of blood. They pulsed with a malevolent energy, mirroring the tendril rising from the blood. These were the anchors, the focal points. With a guttural cry, he brought the rebar down, again and again, smashing the symbols, chipping away at the very fabric of the altar itself. Each strike sent a jolt of psychic pain through him, the whispers in his mind becoming a deafening shriek, the shadows around him convulsing violently. But he persisted, fueled by a raw, primal will to survive, to defy this ancient evil. With a final, desperate blow, he shattered the last symbol. The dark tendril from the blood pool recoiled, shriveled, and then dissipated. The oppressive weight in the chamber lessened. The horrifying whispers faded into a distant murmur, and the shadows seemed to recede, retreating into the deeper recesses of the cavern. The entity had not been destroyed, Mateo knew. Something so ancient could not be truly killed. But its awakening had been stopped, its hold on this place weakened, its power severed, at least for now. The combatants, both Escalados and Locos, stood stunned, looking around at the now less threatening shadows, a profound confusion and dawning horror on their faces. They had witnessed something beyond their comprehension, beyond their gang wars, beyond their prison. The true nature of El Abismo had been revealed, and its limits, terrifyingly, had been pushed back, for now. Mateo, exhausted and bleeding, stood alone by the broken altar, the rebar still clutched in his hand, a solitary figure against the retreating darkness, a survivor of a battle that had transcended the very notion of human conflict. The aftermath was a chilling quiet, broken only by the ragged breaths of the surviving men. The oppressive presence of the entity had receded, leaving behind a profound emptiness, a vacuum where malevolence had once pulsed. The air still carried the metallic, cloying scent, but it was fading, becoming less potent. The Esqueletos, their fanaticism broken, stared at the fallen El Tuerto and the shattered altar with a dawning horror, their faces stripped bare of their former zeal. The Locos, too, were visibly shaken, their bravado replaced by a stunned silence. They had witnessed something that defied their understanding, something that had redefined their entire reality. Diablo approached Mateo, his face grim, a silent acknowledgement of their shared ordeal passing between them. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect, a gesture that spoke volumes more than any words. The gang wars, the prison politics, all of it seemed utterly trivial in the face of what they had just confronted. They had fought a common enemy, an entity that cared nothing for their petty squabbles, only for their despair and their flesh. The climb back through the tunnels was arduous, Mateo's body screaming in protest with every strained movement. The wound in his side burned, his head throbbed, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. But beneath the pain, a new kind of clarity settled in. He was changed, irrevocably so. The man who had entered these tunnels, desperate to survive prison, was gone. In his place was someone who had faced a primal, cosmic horror and, against all odds, had fought it back. They emerged back into the prison's utility corridors in the pre-dawn hours, just as the first faint hints of gray light began to filter through the vents. The prison above was still reeling from the chaos of the night. Guards were everywhere, their faces grim, their batons held tight. The gangs were scattered, the Esqueletos in disarray, the Locos cautious but victorious, though their victory felt hollow, tainted by the horrors beneath. Mateo was immediately seized by a group of guards. His bloodied clothes, his injuries, his presence in a restricted area, all spoke of clear transgression. Officer Ramirez was there, his eyes glinting with a familiar malice. "So, you thought you could disappear, Perro?" he sneered, roughly grabbing Mateo's arm. "You thought you could escape us?" Mateo looked at Ramirez, and for the first time, he felt no fear. Ramirez, with his petty cruelties and his small-minded authority, seemed insignificant, a mere blip on a much larger, darker canvas. He had seen true evil, had touched it, had fought it, and in comparison, Ramirez was nothing but a flickering candle in a vast, unending night. He was thrown into isolation, the infamous caja he had so desperately feared. It was a tiny windowless box designed to break a man, but in the suffocating darkness and silence, Mateo found not despair, but a strange peace. He closed his eyes, and instead of the crushing black, he saw the faint, receding tendrils of the cosmic entity, the broken altar, the faces of the terrified Esquelitos. He had not just survived, he had conquered something far greater than any prison guard or gang leader. He was no longer afraid of the caja. He was no longer afraid of the prison. The tunnel had indeed led to a place worse than prison, a place of ancient, soul-devouring horror. But in confronting it, in pushing back against the abyss, he had found something within himself, a resilience, a will to defy that no concrete wall or iron bar could ever contain. He bore the scars, both physical and spiritual, of his journey, a permanent reminder of the darkness he had faced. He had lost his innocence, his simple desire to fade away. But he had gained something far more profound, an understanding of the true nature of evil and his own capacity to resist it. He was still a prisoner, yes, but he was also a survivor, a guardian of a terrible secret, and a man forever transformed by his harrowing descent into the deep. His old life was gone, utterly consumed, but a new, terrifyingly aware Mateo had been forged in the crucible of El Abismo. Months passed in the caja, then in a new, harsher general population block. Mateo endured the solitude, the beatings, the grinding monotony with a quiet strength that puzzled the guards and unnerved the remaining gang members. His eyes, once full of a cautious hope, now held a deep, knowing stillness, a reflection of the unimaginable darkness he had witnessed. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was low, devoid of emotion, but carried an undeniable weight. He was a ghost walking among the living, marked by a reality no one else truly understood. The prison itself had changed. The unsettling thrum, the deep pulse, was gone. The metallic, cloying smell had faded almost entirely. But a lingering dread, a collective trauma, hung in the air like a pall. The gangs, particularly the Esquelitos, were shattered. Their numbers dwindled, their power broken, their fanaticism replaced by a profound, palpable fear. El Tuerto's death and the revelation of their dark rituals had not only led to internal collapse, but also a brutal crackdown from the guards, who would use the chaos to reassert their absolute dominance. Diablo, for his part, kept his distance, a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret, a grudging respect in his infrequent, wary glances. He understood, as no one else in the prison could, the true nature of their common enemy and the narrow escape they had engineered. Mateo sometimes saw Ramirez watching him, a flicker of something unreadable in the guard's eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or a subtle recognition of the unyielding spirit he could no longer break. The physical scars on Mateo's side had healed, but the internal ones, the spiritual wounds from El Abismo, would never truly close. He carried the knowledge of the ancient entity, its hunger, its patience, its terrifying indifference. He knew it wasn't destroyed, merely driven back, quiescent, waiting. The tunnel was still there, a gaping maw beneath their feet, a silent promise of future horrors. He spent his days in the yard, sitting alone, watching the sun beat down on the concrete, feeling its warmth as a stark contrast to the eternal cold of the cavern. He read his tattered Don Quixote, its torn pages now imbued with a new meaning. The windmills were not just giants, but cosmic horrors, and his own quest was not for chivalry, but for survival against forces beyond human comprehension. He had no illusions of escape from CECOT, not anymore. His future was confined within these walls, perhaps for the rest of his natural life. But the prison no longer held the same terror. He had faced something worse, something that had redefined his understanding of fear itself. He was still a prisoner, but he was also a sentinel, a silent guardian of a terrible truth. The tunnel, which had led him to a place worse than prison, had also, paradoxically, freed him from the mundane fears of prison life. Sometimes, late at night, when the prison was quiet, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor would ripple through the concrete floor. Mateo would feel it, a subtle vibration in his bones, a distant echo of the ancient thrum. He knew what it meant. It was a reminder, a whisper from the depths, a subtle stirring of the great, slumbering evil beneath them. He would close his eyes, listening, not with fear, but with a quiet, steely resolve. He had survived the abyss once, and if it ever truly awakened again, he would be ready. The world beyond the prison walls might be free, but the world beneath held a deeper, more profound truth, and Mateo was now inextricably bound to it, a reluctant keeper of humanity's darkest secret. His journey had not ended with his return from the tunnels, but had simply transitioned into a different, more enduring form of confinement and vigilance.